There it is. Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for joining us today for this topic that I think will resonate with not just young people, but for all of us who happen to be parents as well. Being a psychologist, we wouldn't be immune to the anxiety of how our kids are going to manage when we go back. So what I wanted to start with first is the term you might be more commonly associated with this is school refusal. It's a particular phrase that I have difficulty with. So we can have an idea of a young person who, at the prospect of going back to school that morning, maybe the night before, is what looks like a temper tantrum. They're getting really upset. They're getting very, very distressed. As from my point of view, I prefer much to call it school-based anxiety. If we look at it through the lens of behavior or school refusal, the impression idea that we get is that the child is being, or young person is being oppositional. They're being bold. And when we look at it through that lens, we're much more likely to take a punitive or harsh approach to try and manage it, which pretty much in no cases is going to make the situation better. It'll heighten the emotion for everybody involved. The vast majority of young people that I would meet, and it is very, very common difficulty, who struggle with not going to school, it's because they're scared. They're really, really scared about the idea or the reality of going to school. So I think when we look at it from the point of view of school anxiety instead of school refusal, we're much more likely to take a compassionate view of the situation and the young person, and that's less likely to lead to everybody having particularly heightened emotions. So I think it's important for us to consider maybe some of the reasons why kids, young people, get anxious about the idea of going to school. There can be a multitude of reasons. So for some, it may be that they have either recognized or unrecognized learning difficulties. I've met many young people over my career who would have been perceived as being kind of bold or disruptive in school, but actually had an unrecognized learning disability such as dyslexia. And from their point of view, they would have preferred to be seen as bold than not clever. For others, it might be about prospect of bullying, that they might have to encounter a bully, maybe that has been there before. And even if it's been managed and addressed within the school, as schools will do, it's still the idea that it could occur again, the preemptive anxiety. For some children, it's going to be about separation anxiety. The idea of pulling away, not being around their parent can elicit significant anxiety for them. And it could be things like, will mom and dad get tied up in work? Will they forget to collect me after school? Or a quite common one is, will something happen to my mom and dad while I'm in school? And usually those thoughts are catastrophic. So they'll be in a car crash and they'll die, and I'll be an orphan and I'll be on my own. So that anxiety, that clinging on for safety to the parent can be quite common. I still remember it with my toddlers, dropping them off to crash, literally hanging onto my leg for dear life. So this is something that is really, really quite strong for young people. It's also the self-doubt that they experience about their own worthiness, their belief that they're not good enough, that they can't make mistakes socially, academically, sporting, that they have to be perfect. And also, as was for teenagers in particular, the ultimate challenge and throughout development of teenagers is fitting in, worrying that I'm going to be the odd one out, that I'll be standing in the room with no one to talk to, nobody that will want to be my friend, I'll be alone, I'll be seen as the weirdo, the loner. So that challenge of trying to fit in. Increasingly, I'm also meeting a lot of young people that are really anxious about going to school because they have quite unrealistic expectations of themselves, and particularly in academic areas, where they believe that to be good enough, they have to be perfect, especially if they have some self-doubts about their ability in terms of socially with their peers. They believe that, well, I can't manage that, I don't know what to do socially, and I don't know how to fit in. So if I'm really, really good and perfect academically, then maybe I'll feel good enough about themselves. But often the ability to be perfect in everything academically is just not possible, not realistic. So for a lot of young people that I meet, they will refuse to go to school, avoid school, because if I don't go, I didn't sit the test, therefore I didn't fail it. Many parents worry that when kids have these perfectionistic kind of standards and expectations, that people will perceive, well, it's the parents that are kind of being pushy with their kids. Almost in every case of the young people that I've met, it's their own internal expectations, and certainly not coming from the parents. But again, that could be another factor to consider around why someone might be anxious about going, about the expectations that they have of what it should be. And should is a very powerful and sometimes challenging word when it comes to anxiety. So in my experience, there's 3 primary high-risk times, not the only ones, but the main ones. So September, very, very busy time, obviously with the summer being over. They've been out, they've been having fun, they've been playing with their friends and lack of routine, and now they got to go back into school again. January, again, after the Christmas break, going back in. So predictable enough, those transitions back from break times into it. But also one of the most challenging times that I've experienced with young people over the years is that transition between primary school and secondary school. So in primary school, things are very predictable. We have one teacher, one desk, and one classroom. And then we move from being the oldest, the biggest in the school, to being the smallest again, to having 11 different subjects, 11 different teachers, classrooms, having to move between them, get lockers. There's a lot to manage, a lot to think about, and a lot that they think can go wrong. So in particular, that challenge of moving between primary and secondary school can be one where even if the young person was perfectly settled, not anxious at all in primary, it is a time where there's a risk that they might get more anxious in advance of that. Lots of young people and parents will I suppose come to me searching for answers. We need to know the what. Where has this come from? Was there an event? Has something happened? And in some cases, we may find out that it might be a learning difficulty. There might have been some bullying or something else that's led them to feel anxious. But sometimes we're never going to know the why. And in the search to know the why, we can get lost in the aim, I suppose, of supporting the young person back. So just to understand a bit more, if you were out to sea like this gentleman and you can't swim and you fall off the boat into the water, in that moment, you're not really going to be thinking of, did I slip or my lace is undone? Did I trip over a bucket? You're going to think of, how do I stay afloat? How do I get back into the boat? So we don't want to get too caught up in all of the different reasons, about focusing as much as we can on how we support the young person to reintegrate or to manage that hurdle when they get anxious about it. There's also a piece for us as parents about our own self-doubts. So when our young person is getting really, really distressed and they're begging, they're pleading, there's tears, they're holding on to us, don't make me go, please don't make me go. That's very, very hard for a parent. It pulls on our heartstrings. We don't like to see our children distressed, and we want to do everything and anything we can to reduce that distress. Lots of parents will talk to me about, I worry that if I push them too hard, that they will harm themselves, or in 5-6 years' time, they will blame me for the trauma of me making them go to school. And that's a really hard thing for a parent to manage, to step back from and separate their own emotions from that of their child. And we often will match the distress that they have, and that can get in the way of us trying to figure out what might be the best thing to do for our kids. I think it's important to just focus very briefly on maybe the things that don't work. It really isn't helpful, I suppose, to increase or add to any particular shame that the child might experience, that it's something that they're failing at because they feel like they're so anxious that they can't go. They're already battling with anxiety, and the last thing we want to do is add shame to that, because shame is one of the most challenging emotions that a young person can experience. Again, back to the piece of school refusal versus anxiety. If we take a punitive approach and we punish them for not going, what we're really missing is that opportunity to understand what's going on for them. Now, I'm sure there's probably some of you here are looking at that image on the left and their heart's beating a little bit faster, maybe dry sweat breaking out at the sight of that particular spider. So lots of parents would wonder about, do I just get him and drag him and put him into the car and put him in? And again, that being driven by kind of self-doubt. And in no scenario does that work. It increases the child's sense of panic. And I suppose if that idea was to come to your mind, what I would say is, well, look, if you're terrified of spiders, as many are, if I said, look, we'll put you into a room with 400 and you get over it, I think you'd know that would not be a helpful thing. So it's a technique called flooding. And we know that it really, really isn't successful because it leads to the person being exceptionally overwhelmed. Again, back to the piece around kind of parental self-doubt. What happens if I don't have the fight? If I don't get into the fight with them about getting them to school, does that make me a bad parent? No, it doesn't. And I suppose it's important to name that. Parents worry that if they miss some school, will I get reported to TUSLA? Will the education and welfare officers come knocking on my door? And no, that's not the case. But it is that parental anxiety about worrying what is the right thing to do, and will I be judged by myself, by my family, by teachers, schools, if I don't make them go. But in reality, people who are working in the system know that this can be a challenge, and the parents are doing the best that they can. The other piece about anxiety is that some of the things that they're worried about may be real, or they might be imaginary. It might be something that hasn't happened to them, but they're predicting and thinking and worrying that this bad thing might happen. So it might be that they're worried that a common thing would be that if I go to school, I'm going to get so worried that I'll vomit. And when you talk to them, they have never vomited in school, but the idea that they might, the imaginary scenario of I throw up in school, everyone looks at me, they laugh at me, they judge me. Even though it hasn't happened, the idea that it might activates the anxiety system so much that they fear to go in because it might happen. So we also need to understand why anxiety in itself as an emotion can be so challenging. Compared to most of the emotions that we feel, it activates our internal physiological symptoms arguably more than any other emotion. So we have our classical heart pounding, nauseous stomach, breathing fast, troubles sleeping, trembling, sweating. And for a lot of kids, when they feel that imminent threat coming, that threat that they've perceived, all of those things can be happening at the same time. So their defense mechanism has been activated because they perceive a threat to be there. And they think, I need to get away from this threat because my body is telling me there's a danger here. And it can feel very, very, very overwhelming, especially for younger children. So again, back to the piece of why we have anxiety, it's our radar for signs of threat. Young people can attach and perception of threat to lots of different things, and school is a very common one. So when our anxiety is working well, our radar is finely tuned, like this radar here, where it only sees 3 airplanes. It's not too overwhelming, and we feel like it's manageable because there is always going to be threats, but it's not too many. For some young people, because of experience or genetics or both, or for reasons we don't know, they are that little bit more sensitive to perceptions of threat, and their anxiety system's a little bit more finely tuned. So if you were to think of the radar system not just picking up airplanes, but also birds, it would look a little bit more like this. So that's really overwhelming. It seems like there's danger everywhere. And in that sense, we're going to want to get away from it because we feel really, really, really overwhelmed. And we can't differentiate between where is the danger and where isn't the danger. It feels like it's everywhere. So it can be very, very overwhelming. It's also important, I think, to talk about that there are different phases to anxiety, and particularly about going to school anxiety. So the first of those is going to be the before, the dread, the anticipation. So this could be the night before. You know, for me, when I was younger, the sound of the Glenroe music ending activated my thoughts of, oh, it's time for bed and school. And that was my trigger for getting anxious about going to school. But for kind of kids who are really overwhelmed by it, their mind will start. They will start thinking of all of the possible scenarios of what could go wrong, or believing that it will go wrong the next day. So it's lots of what if thoughts. What if I vomit? What if no one talks to me? What if the teacher gives out to me? What if I forget my homework? What if I don't know what to say? What if they ask a question and they point at me and I don't know the answer? What if I get the answer right and everybody thinks that, oh, look at you, you've got such a big head, you're so intelligent, you think you're so intelligent. I've had some kids who've actually given the wrong answer despite knowing the right answer because they feared that they would be seen as too intelligent. So these what if thoughts, they could be building the night before or a couple of days in advance, depending on how anxious the person is. And again, their mind zeroes in on only the worst possible outcome that they fear is going to happen. So that period of increasing anticipatory anxiety, it's building over a couple of days, and they fully believe that this catastrophic event will definitely happen. Absolutely, I know it's going to happen because my heart is pounding, my stomach is in knots. So if it's not going to happen, why is my body feeling like this? So their own internal feelings convince them that what they're predicting is definitely going to happen. And in that scenario where they perceive and believe that this threat is going to happen, they plan for what do I need to do to keep myself safe from this really, really bad outcome. And in many situations, they plan to avoid it because they think this is the only way that I can keep myself safe from this event, but also keep myself feeling safe from feeling anxious from the feeling itself. During the event, so if they go into the event, if they're in school, while they're there, the main focus of their thoughts, it's internal, so it's ruminative. They're thinking about the situation they're in. They're thinking about how anxious they are. And what they're wondering is, will this anxiety stop? Will it keep growing and growing? Will it get worse? Will everyone notice me? Will they see I'm anxious? Will they notice my shaking leg? That can be quite a common one, where the leg is shaking, the person notices it shaking, and then they get more anxious and it shakes some more. And then what it'll come to during it is, how do I escape? So what's interesting is that in a situation in college, they would have done experiments with eye tracking technology and using a big spider. What they found is when people get anxious, they don't look at the thing that they're fearful of. They look for signs of escape. So in that experiment, the people's eye tracking, they looked at the door or they looked at the window. How do I get away? Because when we feel under threat, we will need to get away from what we believe the danger is. Also, during that situation, when the young person is in school and they're anxious, there's a shift in terms of their attention and their preoccupations. So instead of focusing on what's going on outside of them, so what the teacher is saying, the classroom, the learning, their peers, they focus internally. So they notice the physiological symptoms. They notice their heart pounding, the legs shaking, they may be shaking in their voice, or they perceive shaking in their voice. And then they worry that that's going to cause some judgment from others, which makes them increase in terms of the heart beating in the stomach. And that cycle continues, and often it will get to the point of panic, where they feel that I've got to get away, because all of their attention is focused inward. I've worked with young people who will put their head down at the desk and don't lift it, because the perception is everyone will be looking at me. But because they're so focused internally, what they can't look up and see is actually nobody is paying attention to them. But their anxiety feels so overwhelming, it convinces them that they're constantly being judged by others. So after the event, often a young person, when they come back from school, will ruminate and look back on the day or however long they managed to be there. And they will selectively find out bits that they perceive where they might have embarrassed themselves, or engage in mind reading, where they will assume and conclude what another person thought of in that situation. So they thought I was boring, they thought I was a weirdo, because they didn't look at me, they didn't talk to me. So confirmation bias gets activated. So I believe that they thought I was weird, and I see that they didn't talk to me, therefore they must have thought I was weird. And again, it tends to be past focused and judgmental of themselves about their own performances and how they did during school. So in terms of trying to understand how anxiety can become a problem, because we all experience it. And anxiety, unlike many emotions, doesn't gently make its way up. When we get triggered by an anxiety, such as 8 o'clock, mom, dad said, come on, it's time to go out to the car, get ready for school. In that moment, the anxiety can shoot up pretty fast. It can feel like it just comes out of nowhere. And for most of us, when we get anxious, it will shoot right up. It will stay at 100 for a period of time. And by doing nothing at all, just time itself, the anxiety will reduce. And when I talk to people about this, they can look at me kind of skeptically about, you can't prove that. So what I would do is bring them back to, tell me a time where you were having panic, and they could describe it. And I just ask them a simple question, are you feeling a little bit of panic now? No. And that in itself shows that you cannot stay at that level of anxiety and panic all the time, because what they fear is that the anxiety will keep rising up and up and up and up exponentially, and it won't stop, and it will stay at 100 forever. So I have to get away from it. So for some young people, when they get really, really, really anxious and get really panicked, it hits about 85, 90, and their heart is pounding, their stomach is in knots, their thoughts are rampant with what if scenarios, and all they want to do is to make all of it stop. So they do something, and the anxiety reduces down pretty quickly. In that next scenario, when that scenario comes again, the anxiety shoots up, and they remember, what did I do last time that made me feel better really, really quickly? What made the anxiety stop? Oh yeah, let's do that again. So we see is a cycle of really increasing anxiety, really decreasing anxiety. But what they're doing in that situation is that they're trying to avoid it, and they feel a sense of relief. So to some, you go, well, of course, I do something and my anxiety reduces quickly. Why wouldn't I do that? Because of what happens is that they don't see that the anxiety would actually have reduced all by itself without having to avoid, but also they believe that they have prevented something bad from happening. So if I'd gone into school that day, they would have laughed at me. No one would have talked to me. I would have made a fool out of myself. I have saved myself from this catastrophic event happening. And what reinforces that perception is by avoiding, their heart slows down, their stomach isn't as anxious anymore. And to them, their interpretation of that is a sign that I have stopped something bad from happening. All that has happened is actually they've reconfirmed and strengthened their belief that they've prevented something from happening, and makes it more likely that they will continue to try and avoid, which is a safety behavior. So for all of us, adults, parents, teachers, everyone who works with children, our classic response to lots of people and kids when they get anxious about something is to tell them that it'll probably never happen. Or in Ireland in particular, we tell them it'll be grand. But for the child, when we try to reassure them and tell them it'll all be fine, it'll all be grand, it actually magnifies their anxiety and creates a distance between us and them. Because internally, their body doesn't feel grand. They're very heightened, they're very anxious, and nothing about what they're feeling feels grand. So we tell them it'll never happen and it'll be grand. What they're actually hearing is, you don't get me. You don't understand what I'm feeling right now. And you cannot guarantee me that this won't happen. So even though our instinct is to try and reassure because we want to reduce the distress, it's unlikely to be something that is actually successful in reducing the person's distress in that moment. And the reason is that bad shit happens, bad stuff happens. And particular at the moment, we're going back to school in September and over the last 18 months, COVID. So I've worked with lots of young people who have been really, really anxious about contamination, about fears, about germs, about people getting sick. And we would all reassure them that, no, of course. And then a double pandemic comes along and lots of them have told me, told you so. So there is a heightened sense of anxiety among everybody at the moment. We're all that little bit more anxious, engaging in safety behaviors of distancing and mask wearing and hand washing because of danger. So it's not just anymore about the social piece, about the academic piece. It's also about trying to physically keep safe. And lots of young people, particularly over the last year before the vaccination program rolled out, were really, really consumed and worried about, if I go to school and I pick up COVID, will I give it to my mum who's sick or my elderly granny? And if they die, will it be my fault? So there's lots of additional dangers that young people are perceiving because of the impact of COVID on top of everything else. So important, I suppose, in something like this to focus on the different types of things that would work to support people through the anxiety. And primary among all things is the idea from our colleagues in Jigsaw of one good adult. You are the best support. The relationship you have with your child is the best support to getting them through that anxiety, that sense of connection, that sense of being understood by the parent. And again, back to the piece about if it's seen as school refusal, that can create some tensions in the relationship, and it's less empathic, it's less compassionate. So when we try to really understand what's going on for the child, it does preserve that relationship, and they see that we're trying to understand them and to connect with their feelings. And that comes back to, I suppose, what a lot of us will know about the idea of a secure base in terms of attachment. So when we feel understood, when we feel that no matter what happens, I can come back to my parents and recharge my social batteries, to recharge my emotions, and then to go back out into the world again. Because going into school and mixing with our peers, trying to figure out the intricacies of friendships, what's good enough, how do I be cool, how do I not be bullied, how do I manage all of these day-to-day bits of fitting with my peers, coming back to that relationship with us, with the adults, with your parents, that's the sense of security that they have that allows them the next day to go back out into the world and try and integrate and form attachments with their peers. So never underestimate the power that you have as an adult. Even if your child is quite distressed and you're doubting yourself, you have got them this far in life and you've kept them safe in all other aspects. This is another hurdle that you can support them through by, again, valuing the relationship. But the most important thing that we can do when someone is anxious is to validate them, to tell them that we understand. It makes sense why they're anxious. It makes sense that after the whole summer off that you're a little bit worried about going back to school, that you're nervous that you won't be able to keep up or if someone will talk to you, to acknowledge our own emotions, that we get nervous and anxious about going back to work after 2 weeks holidays, opening up our email and seeing that there's 200 of them that we've got to try and manage. And that when I was your age, I used to be scared of whatever it might be. So it's acknowledging, I see you, I see how you're feeling, and I see how hard it is. That sense of being understood makes them feel connected to you, and that they don't have to feel scared alone. Because being anxious, again, it's an internal symptom. And if we're able to share that and someone else understands us, it's just that little bit less scary because someone understands me. It is important, I think, in particular with school anxiety, also about having boundaries. Because again, the child is getting so distressed, we can go maybe a little bit too much into good cop mode and needing to feel like we need to reduce their distress. But particularly with school-based anxiety, if the child gets so distressed that they stay home from school, we also need to keep boundaries about what happens during that time. So if they're really distressed, they stay home from school and they sit down and they watch TV for a little while, or play PlayStation, or go play on the swing. If they were in school, they wouldn't be able to do those things. And children won't like that boundary. So no, the TV can't go on because you should be in school. And they will see it as being punished, but it's not. If they get that sense of home being a comfortable, safe place that allows me to avoid the feeling of anxiety, then it's much more difficult to reintegrate them back into it because of that. So with these situations, if you find yourself where the young person is so distressed that they don't go to school, or this has been a pattern, it is important to keep those boundaries around school time. So snack and lunch and no TV during that. It shouldn't be a comfortable place. That's not a punishment as much as they might try and convince you that it is. One of the stories that I've been sharing for a while now is something that might be familiar to many of you, a childhood story about going on a bear hunt. And what involves is this family go out searching for a bear. And as they go on this search, they come to different obstacles. The first obstacle is a big cold river, and they stop and they get anxious and they don't know what to do. And they have a little rhythm, a rhyme that they go through, and they realize that, well, we can't go over it, we can't go under it, we have to go through it. So they go in and they wade through the river, and it's cold and it's wet, and they climb out the other side. And each of the obstacles they come to, thick wavy grass, big oozy mud, they have the same query. How am I going to get through this? I can't go over it, I can't go under it, I have to go through it. And in the end, they find the bear, and the bear is a justified, scary thing. And they turn and they run to get home. But as they run home, they come to each one of the obstacles that they encountered on the way there. And each time they get to it, they don't stop. They don't think, how do I get through this cold river? How do I get through this thick oozy mud? Because they've already been through it. So it's important to use opportunities like stories to illustrate that, yes, it can be hard going through it, but once we've gone through it once, we understand the feeling, and we understand with anxiety, the quickest way is often through it. Sometimes for us as parents, or for young people themselves, their expectation might be that I want to get to a situation where I can go to school and I feel no anxiety at all. And unfortunately, again, that's not a realistic thing. And it's as realistic as going down to your local beach like this guy is, holding your hands out and thinking you can stop the waves. Because anxiety comes, and it comes on a daily basis. Most of the time we don't notice it. And only very rarely does it come so huge that it knocks us down. So we need to get to a point where anxiety is something that will happen, and we're accepting of it being in our lives, and being realistic about what we try to do to try and manage it. It's also important to engage with young people, and for us ourselves, about asking, is the avoidant response justified? So if a young person comes to us and tells us that they disclose that they had been perhaps bullied by a peer, and they're really, really anxious about going, yes, in that moment, at that time, it is justified for them to feel anxious and to feel like they can't go, but not ever go back again. So it would be justified to, speak to school, engage with them, and get the supports to manage that. So I'd often, again, challenge young people about school in itself being a dangerous place, and ask, do mum and dad let you go up and play on the roof? Do mum and dad let you take the car for a spin when you're 10? No, because it would be dangerous. So they understand that parents generally will not allow kids to do something that's dangerous. And to challenge that cognitive assumption that school is a dangerous place, well, how come they want you to go to school if normally they don't do things that are dangerous? So we need to have a proportionate response to the level of threat. And while, yes, we can understand that they're feeling anxious, is that level of anxiety justified that they should never go to school? Usually not. So what can be done also is about addressing this with the tendency, the understandable tendency to focus our attention inward when we get quite anxious. So this is the idea that many people will be familiar with, is mindfulness. And what that does is it helps us to practice rediverting our attention. When we get really anxious, we need to divert our attention externally. So focus on what's outside of us rather than inside of us. And by doing that, it allows that anxiety to pass. So again, for young people, they get so concentrated on the what if thoughts, the mind, the heart pounding, moving the attention to what's happening outside of them. So it could be sounds, sight, smells, physically doing stuff that allows that anxiety to pass. There are a few different apps that you could use to help and to practice this. Calm would probably be one of the most well-known ones, but also there is an app from developed by the psychology department in UCD called Mindful Nats with an Irish voice, and I find a lot of people find that quite useful and helpful. But I suppose what's really, really important about practicing mindfulness is you need to practice it at a time when the person is calm, when they're not overly emotionally aroused. It's very difficult to try and learn a new skill for any of us if we're feeling really, really emotional. So we learn these skills in advance. So talking to a young person about the idea of you train for your soccer, your GAA, your rugby during the week, so that when it comes to the match, you can put it into practice. In the same way, we practice mindfulness at a time where we are calm and not feeling particularly anxious, so that we're more likely to be able to do it using muscle and mental memory in those situations when we get anxious the night before school or the morning of maybe going to school. It's also about preempting the return and thinking about things that we could do to make that transition, that maybe that little bit smoother. It will never be devoid of maybe all anxiety. And there's different ways and things that we could do with that. In particular, I know it can be quite difficult with transitions and change for young people who are on the autism spectrum. So we know that children with autism and young people predominantly think visually. They see and they process visual things much more successfully than language. So one idea might be with the school for the teacher to take a picture of the classroom, to take a video walkthrough from the front door as far as the classroom so that they can see it in advance. And if they can see it and visualize it, it becomes that little bit more familiar and less threatening in advance, so that they have an idea of what they're coming into. And a lot of schools are really flexible, really understanding, and happy to do anything that will support that transition. If a young person maybe has been out of school for a little while, one of the things that they really, really get caught up on, and it makes sense, is what if someone asked me why I wasn't in school? Where was I? What do I do? What do I say? I can't tell them that I was out of school because I was anxious, because that will infer more judgment and make me anxious again. So it is important to preempt that and say, if you are asked, why are we out of school? Here's what you can say. Over the last while, people have been saying, look, well, I was a close contact, so I had to stay out. But hopefully over time, that'll become less of a reason. But I wasn't well, or I had to do something, or there's lots of different reasons that might be specific to that young person that they could say that reassures them. But also particularly with children and with adolescents, is that news moves very, very quickly. And very quickly, the fact that they've been out for a while will become yesterday's news. And it's interesting talking to them about their predictions about how long everyone will be talking about them. And then the next week on, actually, after a day, they stopped asking. Because, to reinforce this, that teenagers and young people can sometimes have short attention spans, and that can be a good thing, particularly when we're anxious that they're going to be remembering us or talking about us. I think many of you would be familiar with the idea of CBT, cognitive behavior therapy, which looks at our cognitions, our thinking, and how it influences our feelings and our behaviors. And when we get anxious, we think a lot of what if thoughts, and the behavior we do is avoidance. With anxiety in particular, the vast majority, I would argue 80% of the benefit that you're going to get from CBT is not from the thinking. It's not from the visualizing, it's from the behavior, which is the doing. Because I can sit with a young person and talk to them and rationalize and understand the logic and the thinking of how they will manage to go into school, even to visualize it. But the actual experience of being there will convince them more than anything I or you or anybody else will be able to do, because they have lived it and experienced themselves. But also that they have built confidence, that they have felt this feeling, and while difficult, that they were able to manage it. The most important thing that we can do with the behavior part of CBT or getting a child into school when they're that anxious is to come back to it afterwards. Because when they're really anxious, really catastrophic, believing all sorts of really nasty and horrible things are going to happen, including their own anxiety and ability to cope with it, to come back to them after and say, do you remember you thought this was going to happen and you weren't going to be able to cope? If they can experience for themselves that it wasn't as bad as the really catastrophic thinking, that helps to undermine their confidence, false confidence in their ability to predict the future and how bad something is going to be. So this is a real game changer if you can get a young person to this. So it is important. We sometimes think, well, we won't mention it, we won't talk about how anxious they were beforehand in case it makes them anxious again. But we actually need to do that so that they can see that it wasn't as bad as they thought. If a situation arises where it has got so overwhelming that the young person can't go, one thing that we can do is to do graded exposure. So again, if we think of the spider analogy, when we get really panicked and anxious about that, we would talk about it. We might show a picture of a spider, might look at a video of a spider in a box, a spider in a box in our hand. And we would use the same technique when we would try to get a young person back. This was a situation that I used with a young person who in secondary school, who had been out of school for about a year and a half, really, really overwhelmed by it. And I think the important piece in developing a graded exposure plan like this and a reintroduction plan is that we do it with the young person, that we talk about what is possible. So for this young person, it was so anxiety provoking that even the sight of the uniform made them anxious. So week one was wearing the school work at home, uniform at home, then driving past the school on the Saturday when no one was there to see the school provoke a little bit of anxiety on a Tuesday morning when people were in school. So with a graded exposure plan, the idea is to increase anxiety. So the young person fears my anxiety. So we create a situation where we gradually expose them to the thing that they're fearful of, which on the outside looks like it's school we're exposing them to, but internally what we're exposing them to is the feeling of anxiety in a graded way that they can feel, that they can tolerate and manage it. But also with this, it needs to be that moving forward and that we're moving towards the thing that we're aiming for. So over time, more classes. There will be some bits where they're going to have some blips. But what I want you to think about with a plan like this is that when you move up to the next step, that becomes your baseline. We don't go backwards. So if we got to the point where it was one class on a Monday and a Friday, and the person got really anxious about the next step, we stay there until that anxiety reduces to the point where we move to the next one, but we don't go backwards. It's also about learning to embrace anxiety, to surrender to it. And a way of maybe thinking about that is the Chinese finger trap, which is a toy where you put your fingers in each side, and then when you try to pull them out, it constricts and they get stuck. And the only way that we can get out of that piece is to move our fingers closer. So when we get really anxious, it's about acknowledging it, naming it, moving towards it. And the quicker we move towards anxiety, the quicker that we find a way out through it. In case any of you prefer to read rather than listen to myself all the time, a lot of the content that I deliver in these webinars is on the blog, wanderingmindofaPsychologist.com, where children, parents can go in, browse, and see some of the information just to remind themselves if they forget it. Thank you, and happy to take any questions that might have come in.
Thanks, Mark. There's lots of questions that I'm still getting through, but I'll start sort of at the top. So there's a couple of specific questions in relation to OCD, or obsessive compulsive disorder. So one question kind of asked is, does this process capture the roots of OCD? And then there's another specific question in relation to that. Yeah,
what's really important is OCD is anxiety. It's a different variety, a different form of the overall umbrella of anxiety difficulties. So the same model works within it. So when with OCD, where a person might be fearing certain bad things going to happen, or again, our instinct is to say, oh no, it'll never happen. But again, they believe it. So again, it's about graded exposure. So rather than get too caught up in is it social anxiety, is it panic attacks, is it OCD, underneath all of that, it's still anxiety. It's leaving the person feeling like there's a specific threat, and we have to acknowledge that that threat feels very real to them. So with OCD, when they perform the compulsive behaviors, whether that be flicking on and off switches, washing their hands, they're believing that that has prevented the catastrophic event from happening. In reality, what's happened is it has made them feel relief, and it's slowed down the physiological response of anxiety, which again, for them, confirms that I've stopped the bad thing from happening. So it's about, again, graded exposure and a very slow way, increasing anxiety and reducing the compulsive behaviors to break that link.
Great. And then there's a specific question in relation to a young person experiencing OCD that it's preventing her from leaving the house. And the young person really wants to be in school and actively learning, and the parent kind of wants to know what they can say or do to support that young person.
Again, I think that's back to the validating piece initially, and say, look, it's great that you want to go, and to talk about that it's the anxiety in itself that's preventing them from going. So young people can often think we make assumptions, or they make assumptions that it's a black and white thing. I'm at home, or I'm in school, and it's one or the other. And if it's just going straight into school 5 days a week, 7 hours a day, it's too much. I can't do it. So we sometimes need to talk to them about, okay, well, what would be possible? What would feel possible? In particular, maybe in that situation where they can't leave the house, it's probably likely that it's more about school, not just about school, but maybe more about social anxiety. So I would look in that situation of, well, are they able to go for a walk with the dog? Are they able to go down to the shops? We can sometimes see school as being the difficulty, but actually it's the fear of people. It's the fear of judgment. It's the fear of, what if someone says something nasty to me? What if someone doesn't talk to me? I've often asked that question to young people with school. If you could go into school and there were no pupils, just teachers, would you feel like you had to avoid it? And many people say no, because it isn't the school itself. It's the people in the school. It's the what might happen. It's the risk of judgment. So in that particular scenario, I would look to not only focus on school, but look at opportunities to get that young person out of the house in gradual ways that they can tolerate to be around people. I think it's much more likely then that they could talk about possible return to school.
Great, thanks, Mark. There's a number of specific situations, but this one maybe is quite topical, I suppose. A young person experienced a panic attack after having the vaccine, I guess the COVID vaccine, and is very anxious about having another panic attack. I think the young person is attending counselling support, but the parent wants to know, is anything else the young person can do or attend to alleviate this?
So again, when we talked about anxiety having a direct physiological impact on the body, when we internalize, so when we focus our attention inward, we notice lots of things happening. So we notice a twinge, we notice something with our tummy. And if we look at something kind of catastrophically, if we are quite anxious, we tend to overinterpret what we think that might be. So I notice a twinge, I think I've pulled a muscle, I notice a stomach, maybe I've got an ulcer, maybe my appendix is about to burst. So after getting the vaccine, our body is adapting to it, our central nervous system is adapting to taking that on board. And if in that situation the person had already been anxious, they're more likely to notice those feelings and attach a different meaning to them. So again, it's understandable that they might feel that little bit of panic. But again, it's about being in a situation where the panic is understandable and that panic will reduce. Because if they panicked afterwards, that would have lasted for a period of time, but then it would have passed. And it's important to reflect on that so that, yes, you may feel a sense of danger and panic about it, but it won't last. And also to contrast it with, I suppose, with COVID, and that you perceive there be a risk of a panic attack, but also there's risks with COVID, and which do we think is the greater risk? But again, lots of validation about, it's difficult to get an injection. It's difficult to feel that this is making us uncomfortable or sick. Lots of support and so understanding their point of view compassionately, I think would be important.
Thanks, Mark. My follow-up, just you mentioned sort of nausea and sickness. There's a few questions related to that, kind of young people experiencing physical symptoms in terms of sickness. You may have already answered it, but just that there's a
I think what's helpful with that one is one thing I said earlier on about asking, well, has it ever happened? No, but it's the fear of it happened. I said, okay, worst case scenario, you go into school and you throw up everywhere. What will happen then? Because kids don't allow themselves to go to the worst case scenario of what the outcome is. So if you were to go into school and throw up, what would happen? Well, probably a teacher or someone would come over and check to see if I'm all right. They would get something to get it cleaned away. They'd probably call mum and dad to let them know that they're feeling sick and to bring them home. And they'd worry, look, everyone's going to laugh at me. I said, well, no, you got a stomach bug. These things happen. And again, everyone is going to remember me as the kid who got sick in school. And well, yeah, they may do for a couple of days, but then something else will happen. And ask them about, can you remember sometime that someone in your class did something really silly and people laughed at them? Yeah. Are they still laughing about it? Well, no, because the next thing happened. So we actually need to go to the point of, yes, if you do get sick, if you do vomit, here's what will happen. Here's the steps that will happen. Because they need to feel that there is an outcome resolution to, if the worst case scenario happens, there will still be an option. It may not be something they like, but it will be something that will happen if it happens. Because we don't want to get into a situation where we're avoiding school because of the possibility that it might. And it's similar to a situation around, well, what happens if mum and dad aren't there to collect me? that I'll be left alone, and it'll be, really, really anxious and worrying about it. Well, okay, if mum and dad didn't come to collect me, do you think all the teachers would just drive off home, notice you on your own there, and just leave you? No. Or the kid who lives next door to me, their parent picks me up, they could lift home with them. Or we could get the teacher to ring my parents' mobile phone and find out actually they're stuck in traffic, they're 5 minutes away. So we need to actually go with whatever the worst thing they fear is and brainstorm with them potential solutions to if that worst thing were to happen.
The next question might kind of relate to that. It's just a specific query around a child who's afraid of rain and the weather and fears the worst. Any suggestions around support for that?
In my experience, some of those really quite rare ones, like kind of rain, could be, if we think of an iceberg analogy, what we see above the water is kind of the little tip. And I've met many young people over the years who come with actually those kind of fears, but they're actually quite socially anxious. But to them, it's less embarrassing to say that I'm afraid of specific things than it is to say I'm fearful of people. It can become a way of trying to manage that. It may be that they do have a specific fear about it. Okay, well, what is it that you're afraid of with the rain? Is it that there will be flooding? Is it that the rain is going to get so much that it'll flood and it'll come into our house, or that it'll wash me away? Or so we have to go with the kids' worries when they have them and listen to them and try and understand what it is that they're afraid of happening. But also then with any of these fears is to make that connection between physically what's happening in their body. We fear what we don't understand. And particularly we fear anxiety because we don't understand it. We don't understand that what's happening in my body. How do I make sense of this? And if we make sense of it, it's less fearful because I understand what's happening. So irrespective of what the particular type of phobia or anxiety event is, in essence, what everybody fears about anxiety is the feeling of fear. So the approach that I would use with everybody, irrespective of whether it was vomiting, fear of rain, fear of going to school, fear of germs, fear of anything, is to help the person to get more comfortable with feeling the emotion of fear itself. Because when we try to avoid, we go from place A to place B, we bring that feeling with us. And those feelings are going to keep coming. So we can get caught up sometimes in the specifics of, and some of you will remember the children's game Whack-A-Mole, where you deal with a specific anxiety and fear and phobia about rain, and then suddenly it moves to a fear of open spaces or fear of dogs or fear of heights. And what they all have in common is that the person is still continuing to struggle with feeling afraid because they don't understand it and they haven't developed a confidence in feeling afraid and managing it anyway.
Great, thanks, Mark. Again, a couple of kind of specific questions that are related. One related to anxiety about a specific subject, such as maths, and this is not based on evidence, and the parent wants to know how to build a child's confidence because they won't study because they feel they'll fail. And I think related to that is anxiety about exams, and sort of right now, before the beginning of the school year, even the anxiety about the junior cert starting to build up. Yeah,
a really common one. And again, I think what preempting that with the kids sometimes is about discussions, open discussions with them about expectations of performance, about outcomes. And parents generally are very, very good at trying to reassure the kids that, whatever you do will be good enough. And the hope of parents sometimes is that's enough, but it may not feel enough for the young person, that they've invested so much of their own identity, their perception of what's good enough for them in a specific subject. With the maths piece, I suppose they need to look at, well, what were the pattern of results before in maths? Were they quite good at it and this is a self-doubt piece? Or had they consistently struggled with it? Are they at the right level? Or are they trying to overachieve? Maybe they're trying to do honours when the ordinary level might be actually where they're at, but they're worried about the shame or embarrassment of dropping down to that. So trying to convince them that they're good enough if they believe that they're not is quite hard, because they will seek things that confirms their own biases. So I think I'm not good enough at maths because I only got 97 and I usually get 100. So therefore I need to not do the test in case it drops more, and I dropped 85 and I dropped to 75. So again, lots of kids will try and avoid doing something because of their own unrealistic expectations of what they think they should be achieving. So having a good conversation with them around what is good enough. And sometimes it might be about getting maybe an extra hour or two's help just to build that confidence again that allows them to feel that they can manage.
Thanks, Mark. There's a couple of questions about teachers and how educated they are on these things. So, for example, if a child is behaving anxiously, they could be disciplined or shouted at. How can we manage this? And a kind of follow-up sort of question about initially teachers being understanding, but then potentially blaming parents maybe for not sending children in and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I can understand where those fears would come from. My own experience, I've had really, really good and positive engagement from teachers. And certainly in CAMS, when we accept a referral, we will almost always send out a teacher report form to gather information from the teachers to make them part of that. And when they're kind of engaged with us, then generally they will look for more information. They will ask questions of, I want to know more about how to help this young person. And we will often meet with teachers and like that plan with that young person, work in conjunction with them to devise a plan that works for them and for the pupils. But I think in a situation maybe where a parent might have those doubts is to give that consent maybe for the teacher to make contact with the counsellor or therapist or psychologist, whoever it might be, to form that connection, to have that kind of clear communication, because the more that there's consistency of approach between parents, school and a psychologist or therapist, the more likely it is it's going to be successful because it's being consistent. So involve teachers in the communications, involve them in the plan so that they're part of it and they've signed up to it. And then I think it's much more likely that it'll be more supportive for the kid.
Thanks, Mark. Question about, I think, if a teenager goes to school and then calls to come home on a regular basis, do you leave them to finish the day or collect them?
Extreme. I'm not surprised at all that you came with that question. I think it's important to have that conversation with them beforehand, so it's proactive and not reactive to it. If, as a parent, and parents know when a young person is unwell or not unwell, when they were small little babies, they couldn't talk, they couldn't communicate with us verbally, but we were able to figure out, well, we did our best to figure out if they had wind, if they had a dirty nappy, if they were hungry, if they were tired, and we trusted our judgment. What tends to happen with teenagers is that we forget our own skills in understanding our kids, and we will know whether they are genuinely unwell or not. If we feel, and our instinct is that they're just feeling very anxious, very overwhelmed, knowing that if we bring them home is only going to maintain that anxiety. But we need to have that conversation with them beforehand. So that if you text me during the day, that I won't always be bringing you home because I don't want to make your anxiety worse. I know you will be distressed and I know it will be hard for you, but that, instead of coming home, we got to look for a middle ground. So it might be that we would talk to school and that they might be able to get a pass to use the resource room or the library for 20 minutes or for a class in order to bring their level of emotion down and then go back. What we don't want is a black and white situation, whether it's either school or home, that we have bits in between and that coming home is only the last case scenario in a situation where they are really, really unwell and that it's not the default position.
Thanks, Mark. There's a couple of questions in relation to sleep. So children being afraid of falling asleep or won't go asleep, or a child anxious and fearful of sleeping alone. That's very specific in terms of a death of a parent, but both questions related to sleep.
Yeah, sleep, I suppose, is one of the most difficult times. It does, I suppose, directly relate back to difficulties and anxieties about going to school, because quite often it's the night before when they're lying in bed, they're not distracted by anything else, that the defenses, the guards are down in relation to those what if thoughts, and they start to kind of come in and think about bad things happening, think about the day before, interpret something they may have said and how someone might have thought of them the next day, how they're going to manage that if someone's going to laugh at them. So they can feel really quite overwhelmed by that. That can get in the way of sleep. So again, some of those kind of mindfulness apps or white noises or things that allow them to focus on something other than their thoughts would be helpful. There is, I suppose, a sense of security that kids get at different ages from when they would, crawl into your beds or into someone else's bed to feel that sense of safety. Again, similar to coming home from school, every now and again as a response to maybe high distress for a little bit, yes, but as an ongoing pattern, it tends not to be helpful because we're attaching a sense of dependency that and reinforcing this belief that I can't sleep unless I climb into mum and dad's bed. So it's again, like we would have done with them when they were quite smaller, is validate that they're feeling anxious, upset, and then bringing them back, maybe sitting them for a little bit, but trying to break that pattern because it can be something that they can become quite dependent on.
Thanks, Mark. When might you consider medication for a child's anxiety?
Only in a scenario where all other attempts at kind of psychological support and intervention haven't been successful, and it's been prolonged over time. So where the level of distress just gets so much that they're really not functioning, and that they have tried lots of different approaches using graded exposure or CBT or therapy and counselling, and it just hasn't been successful. In those scenarios, yes, it may be something that might be appropriate to consider, but it would only be for a short period of time in order to support the young person to complete the tasks that they would need to do at reintroduction and then withdraw. So it's not a response or a solution to anxiety in the long term.
Thanks, Mark. Parents' question about getting upset or emotional when witnessing their child going through the anxiety. Is a parent's visible upset likely to have further impact?
It's a fine line, because I suppose you're trying to convey that you're getting the upset. You can see how hard it is, but if our emotion itself kind of maybe spills over, then it can actually have the opposite effect, because a young person might feel that I'm not going to school, that's a bad thing. Now I've got my mom or dad worried and I'm a burden to them, and I'm feeling that weight of, well, I don't want to feel like I've disappointed them or feel like I'm letting them down. So we can convey a degree of it, but I suppose, yes, it probably isn't too helpful to get overly upset, because what we're doing then at that point is that we're conveying that the level of emotion that they're feeling about going to school is valid, that we're almost reinforcing that sense of this is something to be really scared of. So what we want to do is connect and validate with their emotion, and give that sense of understanding, but also at the same time trying to, as best we can, manage our own. But that can be quite difficult.
Thanks, Mark. The mammoth session. This is the last question. Perfect timing. So if a young person doesn't demonstrate any anxiety, do you suss them out anyway to see if they are hiding feelings, or would this cause anxiety or manifest it?
I don't think that we can ever put anxiety into a person, even if we get it wrong. If we're trying to understand our child, that's never a bad thing. Particularly with adolescent boys, anxiety can be manifested through irritability, through aggression, perceptions of, well, I can't talk about feeling anxious because they would think I'm weak, or that we don't talk about those kind of things. So even if it is kind of an aggressive response, it still might be that they're anxious about something but are fearful of talking about their anxiety, because we get embarrassed about feeling anxious, and particularly if we have a teenager who's maybe got a bit of bravado and kind of machoism about him, the idea of admitting anxiety could be a hard thing. So it might be kind of planting that seed and thinking, do you know what, I'm kind of wondering, are you a little bit anxious about it? And even if you get a negative response and they tell you to go away and you're wrong and you're stupid and you don't get me, that's okay, because they may kind of think about it, but also you've opened up the conversation and they might come back to you. Or again, you can go back and go, I was thinking about that again. But not to try and force it, not to try and do it in a sitting down one-to-one, face-to-face, let's have a chat about it. It could be just a casual thing you say in the car on a drive, or just as passing, and planting that seed that I'm just trying to understand what might be going on for you. And I was wondering about, maybe are you worried about something?
That's great. That's all the questions. There's lots of thank yous and very informative comments. And one just for another request for your website or blog again.
Yeah, wanderingmindofapsychologist.com.
And just, I think a few people are asking about whether it's being recorded. Just a reminder that it is being recorded and it'll be sent out to people.
Great. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much to all the attendees, and to Mark for an excellent presentation and for answering all the questions. Like they were being fired at you and you were able to do it, so well done to you. Thanks, Claire, for moderating the questions, and to Jamie from Click Media for helping us with the IT. Otherwise, my own anxiety would have been through the roof. It's bad enough, but I tell you, that would have sent it over the edge. The good news is we have 2 more webinars coming up. The first one is on the 30th of September, and the focus of that webinar will be on older adults, so older teens, I suppose, 18 up. And that's on the 30th of September. And the next webinar is on the 28th of October, and that will focus on children and young people who have had adverse childhood experiences. That's it from us today. Thanks again to Mark and to Claire for moderating the questions and to the attendees. And we'll see you soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Una.